The trouble began the moment I moved into Willow Creek Estates, a neighborhood wrapped in pretty landscaping and polished sidewalks, but ruled by an HOA that had more power than common sense. At first, I believed their rules existed for the sake of community standards. But slowly, something darker began to show through the cracks. It wasn't about order. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control, complete, absolute control. And at the center of it all stood the HOA president, Marlene, a woman whose voice alone could drain the joy out of anything she touched. In the beginning, I tried to stay out of sight, mind my own business, and simply enjoy the home I had saved for years to buy. But Marlene and her board members had other plans. They viewed every newcomer as a threat, every upgrade as an offense, and every ounce of independence as rebellion. I made the mistake of renovating the front garden without realizing they required a formal application for even the smallest change. The next morning, an envelope was taped to my door with unnecessary aggression. It carried my first HOA violation, written in language that felt less like a reminder and more like a threat. At first, I brushed it off. But in the following days, the violations multiplied as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for any excuse to pounce. A forgotten trash bin that sat outside for an extra hour became a fine. My porch light, not matching neighborhood lighting standards, became another. Even the color of my mailbox, which was identical to my neighbor's, was labeled as improper. Every accusation felt deliberate, targeted, and relentless. Soon, I realized I wasn't just dealing with strict regulations. I was being singled out. The whispers around the neighborhood confirmed my suspicion. The HOA had a habit of bullying new homeowners, testing them like predators poking at prey. Some residents simply paid the endless fines. Others gave in, sold their homes, and fled the neighborhood entirely. But I'd worked too hard for this house. I wasn't running. The tension reached a boiling point when I received a letter claiming I owed more than $3,000 in accumulated fines. According to the letter, failure to pay in full within 30 days would result in legal action, possible property liens, and additional penalties. The number was outrageous, especially considering many of the violations were fabricated or exaggerated. But the HOA didn't care. They were testing how far they could push before I snapped. I knew confronting them directly would be pointless. People like Marlene didn't negotiate, they intimidated. But I wasn't about to crumble under pressure. So instead of reacting emotionally, I began gathering evidence. Every letter was photographed. Every inconsistency was documented. Every neighbor who had suffered a similar fate quietly came forward and shared their experiences. It became clear that the HOA had been abusing its authority for years, hiding behind complex legal language and exploiting residents who didn't know how to fight back. Still, the harassment escalated. The HOA hired a private, compliance officer, a man who spent his afternoons circling my street with a camera, snapping pictures of my home from every angle. He parked near my driveway for hours, pretending to fill out paperwork while keeping a watchful eye on my property. It became so invasive that I felt like I was living under surveillance. One evening, after watching the officer speed off as soon as I stepped outside, I reached a breaking point. I realized this wasn't just about rules, they were trying to intimidate me into submission. They wanted me to bend, to pay, to accept their version of order. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Instead of backing down, I decided to dive deeper. I requested the HOA's annual records, financial statements, and meeting minutes, documents that every homeowner has the legal right to access. The moment my request was submitted, Marlene exploded. She sent me 3 strongly worded notices claiming I was interfering with board operations. The tone of her messages grew sharper, more aggressive, almost desperate. That was when I knew something was wrong, very wrong. Why would they panic over something as simple as me viewing the records? The board tried delaying my request, making excuses about missing files and unavailable documents. But I kept pushing. I attended meetings, stayed past adjournment, and wrote follow-up emails they couldn't ignore. And with each step, the board's behavior grew more suspicious. Then came the moment everything changed. One afternoon, while reviewing a stack of papers I had finally been granted access to, papers the board clearly didn't want me to see, I noticed several inconsistencies. Funds labeled for neighborhood improvements didn't match actual community changes. Landscaping fees were doubled without explanation. Contractor payments went to companies that didn't exist. And worst of all, the HOA's reported expenses didn't match the bank transaction summaries. Money was missing. A lot of money. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was systematic, intentional, and hidden behind years of forged numbers and inflated charges. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules for the sake of the neighborhood, they were funding something behind the scenes. And the fines issued to residents, including the outrageous charges they slapped on me, were part of their scheme. At that moment, the harassment made sense. They weren't targeting me because of my garden or my mailbox. They were targeting me because I had unknowingly stepped too close to something they'd been hiding for years. I stared at the document spread across my dining table, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from realization. They had tried to ruin me. They had pushed me, intimidated me, and treated me like an outsider. But in doing so, they had given me the perfect motive to dig deeper. And now, I knew far more than they ever intended. The HOA wanted a fight. They were about to get one. And this time, I wasn't just defending my home. I was preparing to expose every secret they had buried. The discovery of financial discrepancies should have frightened me, but instead, it awakened something sharper: purpose. For weeks, the HOA had pushed me, mistreated me, and treated my home like a playground for their power. But now the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just a frustrated homeowner anymore. I was the person holding the thread that could unravel their entire operation. The next morning, I began organizing the documents into structured evidence. Every strange expense, every forged signature, every mismatched amount was highlighted and cross-checked. I didn't know exactly what the HOA had been doing with the money, but it was clear that thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of dollars had disappeared. The more I worked, the more I realized this wasn't new. This had been happening for years, hidden under vague budget categories and convenient excuses. But if I thought my investigation would go unnoticed, I was wrong. The HOA's so-called compliance officer started appearing outside my home more frequently. He parked with his windows down, pretending to inspect the sidewalk, pretending to check his camera, always pretending, but never leaving. Every time I looked outside, he was sitting there, waiting. But this time, I didn't look away. I stood in my doorway longer than usual, staring back at him without blinking. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being watched. That same afternoon, a notice arrived, hand-delivered, not mailed. The envelope was thick and stamped urgently, as if the message inside couldn't wait even an hour. The letter claimed that due to ongoing homeowner disruptions and failure to comply with multiple corrective actions, the HOA would be initiating the process for a lien against my property. In other words, they were planning to take my home. My fists tightened around the paper. They were scared. And scared people tend to lash out. I knew I needed more than just financial discrepancies to take them down. I needed proof of intent. Proof of theft. Proof of collusion among board members who had unquestioned control over the neighborhood. So I began widening my investigation, starting with the residents who had previously mentioned problems with the HOA. What I found painted an even darker picture. One elderly couple recounted how their monthly dues had accidentally doubled, and when they questioned it, they received back-to-back violation notices until they finally gave up and paid. Another homeowner claimed her roof repair was delayed for months because the HOA insisted on using one approved contractor, a company that mysteriously charged triple the standard rate. A third resident told me that after refusing to pay an arbitrary landscaping fee, he started receiving warnings about noise complaints, despite living alone. A pattern was clear: the HOA used fear to control, fines to intimidate, and violations to silence anyone who questioned them. But it wasn't until I met with a former board member, someone who had quietly moved to another neighborhood, that the real scope of corruption emerged. She told me that a few years earlier, the HOA had started funneling money into emergency funds that never actually went toward emergencies. When she asked questions, board members shut her out, restricted her access to documents, and eventually pushed her to resign. Her warnings to residents went ignored because she had no proof, only suspicions. What she did give me, though, was the missing piece: the name of a private contractor the HOA frequently used for maintenance projects. A contractor with no website, no public presence, and no paper trail. A contractor whose listed address was a P.O. box. Like organized fraud. And now I had just enough evidence to dig further. I spent days gathering more documentation, securing copies in multiple places, and scanning everything into encrypted digital files. Every number was cataloged. Every suspicious transaction was listed. Every unexplained expense had its own folder. I wasn't naive, I knew that going up against a corrupt HOA board was risky. But I also knew that if they wanted a war, I would make sure I walked into it prepared. But while I gathered evidence, the HOA continued tightening their grip. The board issued a neighborhood-wide email, outlining new, temporary restrictions, which conveniently applied only to my property. Parking restrictions. Maintenance checks. Unscheduled home inspections. They wanted me overwhelmed, suffocated, too busy or exhausted to keep fighting. Instead, their desperation only fueled me. The tipping point came one evening when I returned home to find two board members standing near my porch, clipboards in hand, whispering as if measuring the distance between my steps and the flower bed. They scattered when they saw me, but the look in their eyes wasn't authority anymore, it was fear. They knew I was onto something. They just didn't know how much I had already uncovered. Later that night, I received another email from Marlene, the HOA president. It wasn't professionally worded like her usual notices. It was frantic, threatening, dripping with panic. She accused me of conduct unbecoming of a resident and warned me about consequences for pursuing matters outside my responsibilities. The message gave away what she didn't intend to reveal: she felt cornered, and cornered people make mistakes. I printed her email and added it to my growing stack of evidence. But as I sat surrounded by documents, timelines, and records, I realized I was dangerously close to something much larger than neighborhood fines. This wasn't just petty control, it was a financial scheme, possibly criminal. Hidden under the guise of community management. I needed more than paperwork. I needed something irrefutable. Something that would shut them down completely. Something they couldn't deny. So I took one more step, a step the HOA never expected. I contacted a state property investigator. I submitted all my findings through a confidential channel, attaching files, screenshots, signatures, and every shady detail I had collected. The investigator's office responded faster than I expected. They wanted more information, more documentation, more clarity on several transactions. And they made one thing clear. If what I discovered was accurate, the HOA wasn't just breaking rules. They were breaking the law. As I closed my laptop that night, knowing my report had been officially received, a calm settled over me, calm mixed with anticipation. The HOA wanted a war. But what was coming next? They weren't ready for it. Because now, the state was watching. And the HOA had no idea the storm that was about to hit. The days following my report to the state investigator were strangely quiet. Almost too quiet. The HOA, once loud and relentless in their harassment, seemed to withdraw into the shadows. The daily violation notices stopped. The compliance officer disappeared from my street. Even the neighborhood-wide emails slowed to a trickle. On the surface, it looked like peace, but deep down, I knew it wasn't peace at all. It was preparation. They sensed something coming. And they were scrambling. I continued living as normally as I could, though my every step felt like part of a larger plan unfolding. I monitored emails carefully, documented everything, and waited for updates from the state. The silence from the HOA only confirmed that they were nervous, possibly panicked. They had built their power on intimidation, and now someone was finally pushing back. They weren't used to losing control. A week later, the investigator reached out again. Their office had opened a formal case. My documents were valid, my evidence was compelling, and the discrepancies were far too large to be brushed aside as mistakes. Dozens of transactions linked back to the same shell contractor. Several signatures in the budget reports didn't match those of the previous treasurers. Some funds were withdrawn without any records at all. The investigator asked for one final set of documents, attendance sheets from HOA meetings, payment records for the compliance officer, and any direct correspondence showing pressure, threats, or retaliation. I provided everything I had, especially the frantic emails from Marlene that revealed just how desperate the board had become. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers, when it finally hit me, this wasn't just about protecting my home anymore. This was about protecting everyone who lived under the shadow of the HOA's power. People had been bullied, fined, and manipulated for years. Some had moved out because they couldn't take the pressure. Others had paid thousands, never knowing their money was being pocketed by the very people meant to enforce fairness. My revenge was no longer personal. It was justice. The next morning, the storm arrived. 3 unmarked cars pulled slowly into the neighborhood. Shortly after, 2 more drove in. Individuals wearing state investigator badges stepped out, followed by officers carrying folders, clipboards, and sealed envelopes. The quiet street suddenly felt electric, buzzing with attention no one could ignore. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Some stepped outside, pretending to water plants or retrieve mail, just to get a glimpse of what was happening. The investigators walked straight past my house and headed for the HOA office, a building that, until now, felt untouchable. Marlene was already outside, her expression brittle and defensive. Even from my window, I could see the panic in her eyes. She tried approaching the investigators, waving her hands, attempting to talk, but they shut her down immediately. Papers were presented. A search was authorized. And just like that, the board members who had once strutted around the neighborhood like royalty were powerless. For over an hour, investigators entered and exited the building, carrying box after box of documents. I watched as they retrieved binders stuffed with receipts, old financial reports, meeting notes, and laptop hard drives. Every time they walked out with another stack of files, Marlene's face paled a little more. The reality she had feared for years was unfolding right in front of her. By midday, residents gathered in small groups around the street. Whispers spread rapidly, rumors, questions, theories. No one had ever seen the HOA crumble like this. And as more information leaked, neighbors finally understood what their money had been funding, not improvements, not security, not community upkeep. It had been funding theft. And the person who uncovered it was me. Later that afternoon, the investigators visited my home. They thanked me for the detailed report, acknowledged the volume of evidence I had provided, and confirmed that criminal charges were likely. Several board members were under suspicion, including Marlene herself. The contractor they had been funneling money to didn't exist. The account registered to that contractor was connected to a relative of one of the board members. And the fines imposed on homeowners, including the ones I received, were being used to cover up missing funds. The corruption was deeper than anyone expected. But the investigators weren't the only ones who came to see me. One by one, neighbors began showing up at my door, some shy, some emotional, some relieved. They wanted to thank me for standing up, for not bending to the bullying, for exposing what they were too afraid to confront. Many had feared retaliation for speaking up. They had endured years of manipulation in silence. Now, they finally felt free. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the HOA released an official notice, written not by Marlene, but by a temporary state-appointed administrator. It announced that the board had been suspended pending investigation, financial audits were underway, and all fines issued within the last 3 years were frozen. No enforcement actions would be taken until the case was closed. The notice also stated something else, something that made the entire neighborhood buzz. Homeowners who were wrongfully fined or overcharged would be eligible for compensation. It was a complete collapse of the HOA's empire. Word spread quickly. Some neighbors celebrated quietly. Others openly cheered. For the first time since I moved in, the air in the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. The heavy weight of intimidation had lifted. But the greatest moment came days later. A public report was released. It revealed the total amount of money unaccounted for, misused, or suspiciously transferred over the years. More than $600,000. The same HOA that tried to ruin me had been stealing from everyone all along. Marlene and 2 board members resigned immediately. They faced charges for fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying legal documents. The compliance officer who stalked my home was dismissed and investigated as well. The neighborhood, once controlled by fear, was finally liberated. And as for me, I didn't need to shout, brag, or tell anyone what I had done. Everyone already knew. My revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise. Calculated. Irrefutable. I protected my home. I exposed their corruption. And I forced them to face consequences they never imagined anyone would dare bring upon them. The HOA tried to ruin me. But in the end, they ruined themselves.